Christians in America are their own worst enemies. That is the topic of today's Bold and Blunt, and I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. And I wanted to talk about Christian persecution in America, but then Joe Biden came along and hung the LGBTQ pride flag from the White House, wedged in between two honorable American flags, which, as Tom Fitton with Judicial Watch and others have rightly pointed out, this is a clear violation of U.S. flag code. Of course, expecting Joe Biden and this White House administration to care or even know about U.S. flag code is astonishing in itself. But the fact that this flag, this pride flag, hung from the White House in recognition of the LGBTQ rally call for an entire month of recognition for their secular, even pagan behaviors, for their sexual deviancies and so forth, is just astonishing in itself. This is where America is. So I wanted to talk about Christian persecution in America, which I have covered before. And I have a guest who's going to talk about Christian persecution around the world. But then Joe Biden came with this flag, and it outraged me, because when I think about the founding of this great nation, which is based on American exceptionalism, which is based on Judeo-Christian beliefs, which is based on the idea that God endows each of his creations with individual rights and individual talents and an individual message, right? This is all part and parcel of America's DNA. And I think about that, and I think about how in order to keep those God-given individual liberties and so forth, one has to keep God in the equation. Take out God, and what do you have? You don't have God-given rights or God-given talents. You have something else. And usually what it's become in America anyhow is government given, government granted. And I think about the great founding of our nation and the honorable intents of our founding fathers and the Declaration of Independence, the beautiful words that course through that, and the Constitution of the United States, and the guarantee of God-given liberties that document brings forth. And I think about how America has traditionally relied on a strong church community to carry forth those beautiful words of the Declaration of Independence and those God-given liberties as underscored in the Constitution for decades and decades and decades. And then I think about how Christians in America have grown quiet in recent times, and thus we have the pride flag hanging from the White House. And I think, you know what? It's not persecution of Christians we have in America by the atheists and secularists and demons in the Democrat Party so much as it is Christians being their own worst enemies, right? And allowing these things to take place on America's stage. So before I get into a little bit more of that, I want to quickly mention, and maybe it's not even so quickly, it seems to be getting longer these days, but I want to mention that if you like Bold and Blunt, you may get Bold and Blunt at edify.app. That is the online platform for your faith-based podcast. You may also get Bold and Blunt, of course, at washingtontimes.com. Just scroll to the bottom of washingtontimes.com. Find the newsletter section, click on it. Find my particular section, Bold and Blunt with Cheryl Chumley. Click on that, and please subscribe. You will get, along with my Tuesday and Thursday podcasts, you will also get my daily commentaries that I write for the Washington Times. You will get in your email box Monday, Wednesday, and Friday my newsletter that they put out at the Washington Times, containing my opinion pieces and my podcasts. And guess what? Now Washington Times has a new product. It's called Higher Ground. It's a separate newsletter, and in it you can get all things faith. You can get podcasts from Billy Hallowell and myself and Everett Piper, and you can get commentaries related to faith. You can get news stories related to faith. Higher Ground. It's a new product from the Washington Times dedicated to faith-based issues, faith-based reporting, faith-based commentaries and podcasts. Hope you check it out. You can subscribe at that same WashingtonTimes.com link. You may also get Bold and Blunt wherever podcasts are offered, and I'm particularly happy and honored to announce that Bold and Blunt is now part of Pastor Jack Hibbs' Real Life Network lineup. Go there, check it out. You can subscribe to Bold and Blunt there. And you can also pick up a few more podcasts with faith-based angles at that same Pastor Jack Hibbs Real Life Network. There's a lot going on. A lot going on with the faith-based community in America, rising up, raising up, wakening up, awakening, and realizing that, hey, we've been quiet too long, so it's time to get involved, not just on Sunday mornings and Wednesday evenings in church, but hey, how about Monday through Sunday, 24/7? That's what this country needs. That's what founding fathers knew, right? That you needed to have moral, virtuous people in order to keep government limited in scope. Otherwise, chaos would ensue, and then government would claim it has to come in and save everybody from the chaos that has come. And so America, in order to remain free, needs a thriving, active, involved Christian community, which circles me back to my main point. Christians in America have become our own worst enemy, right? I truly believe that America would not be facing these dark, perilous times, such as pride flags hanging from the White House, which is an offense in itself, but it's an offense on a larger theme here. When you consider what the pride flag is, it's the rainbow, right? Which is God's symbol, God's own creation, being thrown back in his face. What a face slap that this LGBTQ community has done toward God and all the LGBTQ enablers out there, meaning Democrats, because let's be real, that's mostly who has enabled the LGBTQ community. But what a face slap, what a mocking to God to take his rainbow, which was a promise to his creations that he would never again flood the earth as he did during the time of Noah, right? He put the rainbow in the sky to remind us all, hey, he's never going to do that again. He's never going to flood the earth again. And the LGBTQ community takes that beautiful symbol that God created, and they put a satanic spin on it and use it to advance their own deviant agendas, right? Let's be real. There's nothing about the LGBTQ community that is godly. Just putting forth the idea that God's creations have to identify themselves first and foremost by a sexual choice just flies in the face of what God intended for humanity, what God intended for his individual creations. We're not born with a purpose in life to identify sexually first, right? We're born to identify as children of God. So the entire agenda, the entire theme that undercuts the LGBTQ community is one that just flies in the face of God's intent. Let me get back to my point here, though. Christian persecution in America, and are Christians our own worst enemies? Well, to answer the second question, yes, we are our own worst enemies. If Christians had been more involved in the past couple decades even, getting involved with the school boards at the local level, getting involved in local politics, being open about their opposition to secular atheist demonic ways of life being pushed into society and normalized in society, not being hesitant to call out things as sin and evil, right? Instead of just saying, well, I don't want to cast stones. I don't want to appear judgmental. I don't want to cause problems. It will make me uncomfortable. Well, you know what? Sometimes evil needs to be called out as evil so you can send that evil back into the dark corners where it belongs. Because if you don't call out evil as evil, then evil thinks, oh, I've got an in here. I can go forth and multiply. And that's exactly what evil has been doing in America. And now we're in a position, if you're a Christian in America, that you feel as if you're supposed to apologize for your Christianity. You're supposed to lock it up and box it up and keep it for Sunday mornings in the pews only. Well, that's not how this country was founded. That's not what made this country what it is. And that's not how American citizens should live. We should not live as if Christianity is something of which we should be ashamed or quiet. We should proclaim our Christian beliefs loudly and proudly, because that is what brings forth those great American principles like equality and justice and law and order and rule of law and order and truth and virtuous living and principles that are based on traditions and normal behaviors, not deviancies. Rumors of the persecution of U.S. Christians are greatly exaggerated. That is an opinion piece in Newsweek from Jason Fields, penned and published May 22nd of this year, 2023. Okay, so that's one opinion. And then there's this. May of 2022, a survey from Relevant Magazine, 59% of American Christians say they're persecuted, but then it's commed with this, may not understand real persecution. So how do you define persecution in the first place, right? If you define persecution of Christians as getting your heads cut off, then certainly that's not taking place in America, right? But if you define persecution a little bit more loosely, well, maybe wearing Christian crosses to public schools or t-shirts that say I love Jesus in shopping malls may get you in trouble, may get you sent home from school to change or booted out of the shopping malls or put in positions where you have to stand strong for your right in America to wear a t-shirt that says I love Jesus. Or maybe you might even have to contact an attorney or a nonprofit organization dedicated to fighting for religious freedom rights in America in order to launch your defense in the court system. And a lot of times people win, right? Like the Christian cake baker. He had a long journey to the U.S. Supreme Court, but he won, right? So is that persecution in America? I would say that the persecution in America that Christians face is due in large part to the weakness of the Christian community in America the last couple decades to keep on the public stage their right to be Christian openly and publicly. So the persecution is not so much persecution as it is weakness of the Christian community to stand strong for biblical truths, biblical ideals, and stand strong bluntly for God. So where we're headed in America is down a path of losing religious freedoms, which very well could one day bring about the type of persecution that takes place against Christians in other parts of the world that is more violent in nature, that is more devastating in nature. Oh, but it could never happen here in America. Well, guess what? I never thought in America that there would be a pride flag hung from the White House with the okay of the President of the United States, who wedges that pride flag in between two American flags. It's like saying to the world, abandon God, all ye who enter here. It's an announcement to the world that America embraces evil. This President of the United States is evil. The LGBTQ community is advancing evil. And those who support the LGBTQ community are enabling the advancement of evil. This is not about equal rights here. The LGBTQ agenda is not about making sure that those who choose different sexual partners or those who have a different sexual lifestyle than what is traditional, what is normal. It's not about making sure that those people are not discriminated against or those people are not targeted for violence. There are already rules and laws that guarantee you can't go around and beat people up or attack people on the streets for no reason. There are already court cases that have already guaranteed that those laws will in fact be upheld in the courts. This is not about protecting the LGBTQ community from violence. This is about the LGBTQ community advancing an evil agenda and the politicians who hop on board to help advance this evil agenda. This is what this is about. And really what it comes down to, this is about the Christian community in America who should know better, who does know better, who reads the Bible and should understand better, being too quiet over the last couple decades, especially under Barack Obama, being fearful of speaking out and being called a racist under Barack Obama. And now we're on this path in America of really total peril. We already had gay marriage ushered in by the U.S. Supreme Court, and that was a big mocking of God's law. And now we have the LGBTQ agenda being displayed at the White House as something that America embraces. I don't know where this leads, but it can't be good. So Christian persecution in America? I don't know. Christians are persecuting their own religion, it seems, by being too quiet. Too quiet, too silent, too complicit with the evil that's taking place. I have a guest today, though, who is here to talk about real Christian persecution around the world. And the stories he has to tell about what some people suffer for their faith, for their love of Jesus, is both heart-wrenching and inspirational. Todd Nettleton, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. It is so great to have you here.
It is my privilege. Thanks for having me.
Tell people a little bit about what you do and how extensive your travels are.
Well, I work for the Voice of the Martyrs, which is a ministry to persecuted Christians, and VOM is active in more than 70 countries, helping Christians who are persecuted for doing what American Christians kind of take for granted, for having a Bible, for gathering with other believers for worship, for maybe talking to an unbeliever about their faith in Christ. Christians in more than 70 countries can pay a price for doing those things. And so Voice of the Martyrs seeks to assist them, encourage them, help them, and tell their stories to American Christians so that we can pray for them, so that we can connect with them and bless them. And on occasion, I get to travel and go and meet with persecuted Christians and sit down with them firsthand, and then come home and do interviews like this one, or produce our weekly radio show at Voice of the Martyrs, or even sometimes write for our magazine, or even write a book. So I get to help tell those stories.
Yes, and I wanted to talk about your book because some of these stories have touched you to such an extent that you wrote the book, When Faith is Forbidden, 40 Days on the Front Lines with Persecuted Christians. That is such a powerful title. I wonder if you could maybe explain some of the persecution that you yourself encountered while traveling, while speaking with Christians.
You know, I consider it a holy privilege to be able to sit down with persecuted Christians, and I have heard really all kinds of stories from what we might consider kind of minor harassment, minor discrimination. Hey, I'm not going to rent an apartment to you because you're a Christian. Hey, you get fired from your job because you're a Christian. All the way up to brothers and sisters who have had a family member killed because they were a follower of Christ. People who have been in prison, sometimes for long periods of time, because they were followers of Christ. And so the chance to go and sit down with someone who's in that situation, it's in many ways it's humbling because they are so faithful, and I consider them heroic as I sit down with them. But I know I'm also kind of asking them to relive maybe one of the hardest times in their lives, maybe one of the most difficult places they've ever been, one of the most difficult parts of their journey. And so I know I'm asking a lot when I sit down and say, hey, I want you to tell me about this. But what comes through again and again in the stories, certainly the stories in the book, and many of the stories I've heard over the years, is just the faithfulness of God in the midst of those really difficult circumstances, and how God shows up. He sustains them, he encourages them, and even allows them to have a positive outlook, to have an impact on the people around them in the midst of that suffering. So one of the stories I tell in the book, and one that was really deeply impacting to me personally, was going to Turkey 7 weeks after three Christians in Turkey were killed. One of them was a German citizen, the other two were Turkish citizens. And I got to meet, two of the men were married. I got to meet both of their widows. I got to meet the fiance of the third man. He was not married, but he was engaged to be married. And just hearing their stories and seeing a very real grief because they had just gone through this terrible loss, but at the same time, their faithfulness, their desire to keep serving the Lord, even though it had cost them greatly, and being there with them, hearing their stories, again, so fresh, just 7 weeks after the murders, was a very, very impacting thing on me.
I want to talk a little bit deeper about what you just said, about how when you've spoken with those who have suffered for their faith, it's become clear to you that God does not abandon them during their suffering. Could you explain a little bit more? Because I think there are plenty of people out there, first off, who draw inspiration from stories of people who stand strong on faith no matter the adversity they face, but perhaps what's keeping them from doing the same is they fear that God won't come through for them, that God will leave them hanging in the wind. Can people rely totally on God to stand by them when you stand up for your own faith?
You know, the Bible says, if you deny me before men, I will deny you before my Father. But if you acknowledge me before men, I will acknowledge you before my Father. And I think that acknowledgement isn't just in eternity. That acknowledgement is in the present tense. And your question actually reminds me of a conversation I had in China with a young lady. She was a college-age lady hosting a house church meeting in her apartment. And in the course of our conversation, you know, we talked about the fact, hey, you're hosting this house church meeting in your apartment. You know that's illegal. You know the police could come in. You could be arrested. And I said, are you afraid? And she said, yes, I'm afraid. And my ears kind of perked up because I don't often hear that response. Usually it's someone who says, no, you know, the Lord will take care of me. It's all fine. And she said, no, I am afraid. And as we left that meeting, the pastor, her pastor that had taken me to meet with her, he said, you know, she's afraid because she's never been arrested before. He said, once you go through that experience and you understand that God is with you, he does sustain you in the midst of that, you're not afraid anymore. The fear kind of evaporates after that first experience. And so I think there is fear, and I think it's natural for us as Christians in America, where we have experienced so much freedom, to have that fear and to think, okay, you know, what if this happened? How would this go? And I think once we go through that experience and we can trust God and we see that firsthand, I think a lot of that fear will dissipate.
And then, of course, the non-believer would say, well, what about those people who are killed? In some instances, horrifically mutilated and tortured before they're killed for their faith. They would ask, where's God in that?
You know, it's a hard question to answer, and I think even as we look at the history of the Christian faith, it is built on God's Son offering himself up and being horribly mutilated and killed on a cross. And so I don't think it should necessarily shock us that some of his followers would also go through suffering. And in fact, it's exactly what Jesus promised would happen. You know, Jesus said, the world hates me, and if you follow me, the world will hate you too. So one of the things, though, that does happen is God is present in those times of suffering, but he also uses those times of suffering to build his kingdom and to encourage others and to draw others into faith in him, in Christ. One of the stories, and we mentioned Turkey, one of the things that happened after those three men were killed, the two widows of the men who were married were on national television in Turkey within about 24 hours. They were on national TV on like Turkish CNN saying, "I don't hold this against the men who killed my husband. I forgive them." And in that culture, in that context, that is such a mind-blowing thing for to offer forgiveness, to not want vengeance, to not want payback against those who have harmed you. That is such an earth-shattering thing that a Turkish journalist, actually a Muslim Turkish journalist, pointed to those two ladies making that statement of forgiveness, and he said those ladies did more for Christianity in Turkey than 1,000 missionaries could have done in 1,000 years.
Wow.
And so God took the deaths of these three men and the willingness of these two widows to forgive, and he turned that into something that, again, a Turkish Muslim journalist said did more for Christianity in Turkey than 1,000 missionaries could do in 1,000 years. So God takes the suffering and he turns it for good.
Wow, that's awesome. You know, it was a difficult question to answer, but I think you answered it really well. Very inspirational and motivating. When you look around at Christian persecution in the world and you hear in America Christians being persecuted, first off, do you agree that Christianity is under attack in America, that there is Christian persecution in America? And secondly, if so, how does the persecution of Christians in America differ from what you see around the world?
You know, that's a hard question for me to answer because as I think about Christians like those in Turkey who laid down their lives, we don't see that very much in America. I mean, and so if that's your idea of persecution, then it's hard to say what's happening in America is persecution. But I would say that we do see clearly the cultural current is turning against Christianity, and as biblical disciples, we're being asked more and more to swim upstream against the culture. And that is producing pressure. That is producing discrimination. That is, having people have their business accounts canceled. People have been fired from their jobs for holding biblical positions. And so I think, yes, you have to say that persecution is happening. The thing about that is it's probably going to get worse. And so we as Christians kind of need to prepare ourselves. Hey, it hasn't always cost us in America to follow Jesus Christ, but that day is probably coming. So we need to prepare for that. And that involves preparing ourselves internally, spiritually, counting the cost ahead of time. And I think one of the ways we do that is, frankly, knowing the stories of our brothers and sisters around the world who've already been there, who've already been persecuted, seeing how they endured and how they kept their faith intact in the midst of persecution. I think that helps us prepare as American Christians for whatever may be coming. And I don't want to put a date on it, or I don't want to say this is and that's not persecution. But all of us will be called on to sacrifice some things to follow Christ. We need to prepare ourselves to make those sacrifices and to do so willingly. We need to see that as an offering that we're giving to the Lord, not necessarily something like, oh, this is terrible. How could the Lord allow this to happen to me? But no, I am offering this to the Lord, and what Jesus said, that the world would hate me, that's coming true because Jesus tells the truth.
Let's just wrap up by talking about this Day of the Christian Martyr that you're involved in. Tell a little bit what it is and whether people can get involved in it. What's going on there?
Well, Day of the Christian Martyr is a day every year. It's June 29th, which is, according to church history, that's the day the Apostle Paul was executed outside the city of Rome. So that's the genesis of the Day of the Christian Martyr. And every year at Voice of the Martyrs, we try to hold up the example of someone who gave their life for Christ. And so we, in some ways, honor, in some ways, celebrate the life of a martyr. This year we're focusing on an ethnic Somali, a man named Abdiweli Ahmed, who was killed in northern Kenya 10 years ago, 2013. He was a Muslim convert. He came out of a Muslim family, found Jesus Christ, chose to follow Jesus, was threatened almost from day one. In fact, at one point, as a young man, people came to his house searching for him to kill him. And he was beaten up multiple times. He suffered a great deal, but he continued to follow Christ until 2013 when he was shot and killed. the purpose of Day of the Christian Martyr is really for us as Christians to look at these examples and be inspired by them. You know, Abdiwali gave his life for the cause of Christ. What would I give to see my neighbors reached with the gospel? What would I give to see my city changed with the message of Jesus Christ? That's really what we want people to think about, and these stories are very inspiring and help us think about that and help us see that whatever price we pay in the scope of eternity, it is a small thing to sacrifice.
Let me just ask you one more question. Listening to you speak about Christianity around the world and how people have given all for their faith, and now this very worthy endeavor, the Day of the Christian Martyr and so forth, and how people might honor Christians who gave all for their faith. Looking at America right now, these are tough times in America from a Christian point of view, what's going on culturally and politically. So I wonder if you could possibly weigh in on how best to pray for America at this time.
You know, I think we need to pray, each of us as followers of Christ, we need to pray, Lord, help me to follow you wholeheartedly. Lord, help me to follow you boldly. And I think as we do that, we can change America. As more of us are biblical disciples, truly following Jesus, the country, the people around us will be impacted by that, and ultimately our country will be impacted by that. Beyond that, I think we pray for those in authority over us. I pray for our leaders to really have a desire to follow the truth, to follow biblical concepts of leadership, biblical concepts of governance, and pray for them to have wisdom and discernment to know how to do that in these difficult and somewhat trying and confusing days. Praying for our leaders to have discernment to know how to make wise choices, and then the courage to make those wise choices. I think those are very worthy prayers.
Those are good words of wisdom. Thank you. Todd Nettleton, I want to thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. First-time guest, but I do hope you come back again.
I would look forward to that. I'd love to come back. Thank you for having me.
There you have it. Don't forget, check out Day of the Christian Martyr. There's a website for it, persecution.com. It is June 29th. That's when you want to keep in your hearts and minds and prayers for those who give all for their faith, for those who gave all for their faith. I want to thank you for listening. Remind you, if you like Bold and Blunt, you may get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, at washingtontimes.com, where you may also subscribe to my 3 times a week newsletter. And you can also get Bold and Blunt, guess what? Wherever podcasts are offered. Tune in next time, and in the meanwhile, don't forget, stay blunt, stay bold.